Asuka Langley Soryu is objectively Evangelion's most popular character, and with good reason. Asuka's grit, fearlessness, and outspoken personality gave her a standout role among her fellow pilots, especially when contrasted with Shinji Ikari's more passive disposition. Despite her popularity, however, Asuka was subjected to the biggest retcon among Evangelion's main protagonists, a decision that split her into two different characters. This controversial move essentially replaced Asuka Langley Soryu with an imposter, leading many to wonder what Hideaki Anno intended all along. Hello Funkers, Tony Funk here, and today we're going to explore this controversy and uncover the real reasons Anno replaced Asuka Langley Soryu with the Shikinami variant, and in the process understand his feelings about the two Asukas he created. So welcome Funkers to A Tale of Two Asukas. It was during Anaheim's 1996 Anime Expo when Hideaki Anno publicly revealed that his favorite Evangelion character was Asuka, coyly adding that he found her cute. After hearing from a fan that most Americans favored Misato, Anno retorted, "I'm surprised. In Japan, the overwhelming favorite is Rei. They can't handle strong women such as Misato and Asuka." Now perhaps this was true in 1996, but 24 years later, the tide shifted dramatically. Between March 27th and April 29th, 2020, Japanese public broadcasting channel, NHK, conducted an Evangelion popularity poll and aired the results that following May. Unsurprisingly, Asuka topped the polls and was crowned as EVA's most popular character by the network. What some may have overlooked, however, is that NHK did not specify which Asuka won, a pedantic distinction that was going to matter a lot more than anyone would expect. At the time of NHK's poll, Asuka had already been split into two distinct characters, with her name change from Asuka Langley Soryu to Asuka Shikinami Langley having occurred nearly 12 years prior following the release of the feature film, You Cannot Advance. In addition to Asuka's name change, her appearance and personality were altered, with her hair color changed from red to brown and her hatred of dolls replaced with a transition object relationship to them instead. More on that later. Despite these changes, Asuka's deviation from her original counterpart was only marginally greater than Rei Ayanami's during the second film of the Rebuild series. This prompted fans to question the significance of Asuka's name change. During a promotional interview for the Evangelion 2.0 Complete Records collection, Anno said the following: "Because I changed the sete relating to the EVA pilots, in order to provide consistency in accordance with that, I thought it was best to change the name. I also thought that the change in name of a main character would enable viewers from the previous work to receive the message, 'This time is different, a new feeling.'" And though Anno referenced changing the character's setes, a Japanese term that refers to a character's relation to their environment and story, the third film of the series had departed so much from the original source material that every character's sete had naturally changed. This meant that by 2020, participants of NHK's poll who were familiar with the rebuilds viewed Asuka's dual iterations in a similar vein to all the other rewritten characters. Of course, everything changed with Rise Upon a Time. In this film, the differences between the two Asukas grew considerably, and in the process, revealed Anno's more substantive intentions with the character's changes. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about how Asuka Shikinami Langley first came to be. Asuka's return to the big screen became almost inevitable following the end of Evangelion's critical acclaim. The film's box office success not only brought prestige to Gainax and Anno, but cemented Evangelion as a household name. Naturally, Anno felt inclined to continue his legacy and waited for the right moment to rebuild Evangelion. The genesis of the Rebuild series traces its roots back to 2001, a mere 4 years after the release of The End of Evangelion. In its original form, the subsequent installment of the Evangelion franchise was supposed to be a self-contained reboot of the series akin to Gundam G. According to Anno, his ambitions at the time were to turn Evangelion into a universal classic by renewing interest in the series with additional storylines. During an interview for the Evangelion 1.0 Complete Records collection, Anno commented, "The main thing was that I was aiming to make EVA into a Gundam or a classic. One of the ideas was to create a new series under the title of Evangelion as Part 2. My ideal was to create G Evangelion." Anno's ambitions, however, were met with apprehension, with the majority of his Gainax would-be collaborators ruling out their involvement. Despite this, Anno remained steadfast and in 2005 established Hara Incorporated after nearly 4 years of personal investments. Hara's creation not only allowed Anno to work on G Evangelion, but it did so with impunity. With this newfound creative freedom, Anno revised his G Evangelion vision, and as early as 2007, described a similar series to the one that became the Rebuild of Evangelion, with him stating, "I felt that the first and second films should be a compilation plus more, and only the last film should have a slightly different story." Though Anno eventually departed from his original comments, making the series 4 films instead of 3, and altering the plot more substantially, his idea remained relatively the same. This means that the Rebuild series was not only created for frivolous reasons, but that Anno's vision included a diverging narrative from the very beginning. At the time of Anno's comments, however, the second film was not yet in production, and Asuka Langley Soryu's future was still in the air. You see, though Hara had written the script for You Cannot Advance at the time of Anno's comments, its production had been indefinitely delayed. According to Anno, he and his staff began to experience burnout after working on the 2 films consecutively. This led Anno to make an executive decision and halt all production for the second film. This delay, however, gave Anno plenty of time to look over the script, and let's just say he started to have second thoughts about it. Anno recounted, "We had planned to begin work on 2.0 without any pause or interruption once 1.0 was finished. However, I couldn't live up to it. After the 1.0 premiere, I decided to look again at the content of the second part, starting from zero. From that point forward then, Anno began to rework everything, and even characters, of the original script. This means that You Cannot Advance became the first film to deviate from Anno's original G Evangelion vision, and as a result, deviate significantly from the original series. But if this is the case, what caused Anno to U-turn on his plans for the series and rewrite the second film? Well, the short answer is Mari Makanami, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Film production, whether it be live action or animation, is typically divided into 5 to 7 phases. Pre-production, being the second phase, consists of the framework, including guidelines such as scripts, storyboards, and settings by which the production crew can work within. Because Anno planned to recap the original series for the first 2 Rebuild films, Hara was able to reach the pre-production stage for both films at the same time. Though the latter stages of You Cannot Advance lagged behind the first film, its storyboards, test footage, and script were already finished. This meant that by the time the first film was completed, Anno already had test footage for You Cannot Advance, and in an attempt to stir hype for the sequel, decided to release some of it in the form of an episode preview during the film's premiere. According to Anno, the preview received a quote-unquote big reaction during the premiere, surprising him in the process. One clip in particular, however, caused the biggest reaction during the preview, and as a result, prompted Anno to reconsider his old script. Though Mari Makanami's face was on screen for a total of 1 second, the uproar her appearance caused was noticeable. At the time, nobody knew who Mari was, but perhaps because her appearance followed a theatrical recap of a series that at the time was 10 years old, the novelty of a new character was exciting. Whatever triggered this excitement was irrelevant. Mari was popular, and Anno needed more of her in his script, considering that she was barely in it. There was only one problem. The script was finished, and there wasn't any more room for Mari. Exhausted from the previous film, and faced with a daunting script revision, Anno bought himself time and delayed the film. This decision, however, objectively killed his original vision, and allowed him to rework Mari's brief appearance and turn it into, well, more screen time? Regardless of what Mari's new role was, her expansion came at the cost of the original plot, more specifically Asuka's story beats. But don't take it from me, Anno remarked, "Because I would surely place emphasis upon Asuka, I didn't intend to seriously deal with Mari in 2.0. However, there was so much anticipation for Mari among the viewers that I felt I had to respond to that." This modification didn't just truncate Asuka's role in the film, however, it changed everything about the rebuilds moving forward. Though You Cannot Advance was already supposed to have differences from the original series, the most notable one being Toji's replacement with Asuka during the Unit 3 test. The film was supposed to play out much like the original series did up until that point. In fact, according to Anno, the original script included character nuances, such as Asuka's discord with her mother, Asuka's idolization of Kaji, and her immediate friendship with Hikari. With Mari's newfound role in the picture, these nuances and plot points had to be set aside and reevaluated in order to keep an engaging pace. The biggest question that remained was how this would affect the series moving forward. In an attempt to answer this question, Anno and several writers held a 3-day retreat to plan out their new vision for the Rebuild series. It was during this meeting when the most significant changes were made to both the plot and the characters, the bulk of which changed the trajectory of Asuka's role and characterization. As a result, Draft 16.2 was approved, and Asuka Shikinami Langley was born. This means that Asuka's new name and sete were the result of Anno's attempts to salvage the character after having to cut elements of her backstory and characteristics in the new script. Instead of exploring these cut elements in the subsequent film, Anno opted to scrap Asuka's old history and focus on a completely new version of the character so as to not crowd the following films with the exposition everyone was already familiar with. In summation, Asuka Shikinami Langley's creation was an attempt to keep an Asuka-like character in the Rebuild series without having to rehash the complex backstory that defined her original counterpart. But when You Cannot Advance was released, the implications of this new version of Asuka weren't well known. Though Asuka's name and hair changed, so had many other aspects from the original series, including the overall plot, as well as several character personalities. Even the following film, You Cannot Redo, failed to expand on Asuka's seemingly innocuous changes. Because of these factors, the repercussions of these changes didn't fully manifest for another 12 years, and in the interim, to many fans, Asuka was still Asuka. With the release of Thrice Upon a Time, however, all doubts regarding Asuka Shikinami Langley's distinctiveness went away, and the film finally distinguished her as her own separate character. So there you have it. Unlike the other characters from the original series that were retconned, Asuka was instead replaced. Ergo, case closed. Ergo, this should be the end of the video, right? No? Well, while this explains why the Soryu version had to be scrapped, it doesn't explain Anno's intentions with the changes he made. In order to explain that, we have to rewind and talk about the revelations from the end of the Rebuild series that made Shikinami's backstory so controversial. Of course, everything changed with Thrice Upon a Time. In this film, the differences between the two Asukas grew considerably, and in the process, revealed Anno's more substantive intentions with the character's changes. The final film of the Rebuild series premiered on March 8, 2021, and received resoundingly positive reviews. It was also the second highest grossing Japanese film that year, and the highest grossing Evangelion film ever made. Despite its praise and financial success, however, audiences struggled with the film's rapid introduction of lore and underexplored plot elements. Award-winning journalist and film critic Richard Whittaker described the continuity in the film as stripped down and impossibly convoluted, a criticism that perfectly described audiences' opinions of Asuka Shikinami Langley's newly introduced backstory. You see, following the climax of the film, a series of flashbacks were used to wrap up multiple characters' story arcs, as well as to reveal previously withheld information regarding their origins and motivations. Though this device was mostly used to great effect given the resolutions it provided for several character conflicts within the Rebuild series, it only partly fulfilled this function with Asuka Shikinami Langley, who from now on we'll simply refer to as Shikinami. While the flashback was effective in explaining the existence of another Asuka within Unit 13, as well as giving context for her comfort doll's existence, it created an unnecessarily divergent history to accomplish these objectives. The lack of build-up regarding Shikinami's backstory then made the revelations from the flashback feel jarring and unearned. And though Shikinami's non-Lilin origins were teased in the preceding film, the revelation that she was a clone felt even more arbitrary than if she was revealed to be an angel instead. But where the scene fails from a narrative perspective, it succeeds in two major ways. For starters, it redeems Anno and his staff for cutting all of the Asuka personality-defining moments in You Cannot Advance, by replacing them with new ones. And though the changes themselves might not have been so great, they more importantly recontextualize and even accentuate the character-driven differences between Soryu and Shikinami. This implies that the intention of creating a new backstory for Shikinami during Thrice Upon a Time was never to serve the plot of the film, but rather draw attention to the fundamental differences between her and Soryu during You Cannot Advance. What's even more fascinating than these differences, however, is the thought process behind them and the implications they create regarding Anno's view of the original Asuka. Now, before I get into the implications, I have to break down the differences themselves. Starting with Shikinami's first appearance in You Cannot Advance, we saw that she was openly hostile toward Shinji from the get-go, as opposed to Soryu. Soryu, on the other hand, started off indifferent towards him, before developing a competitive attitude after learning about his high sync rate during his first fight. Similarly, Soryu's attitudes towards Rei were significantly more friendly, with her even offering to be her friend. Shikinami instead called Rei the commander's pet during their very first interaction. In retrospect, this initial difference was less indicative of a change in Asuka's characterization, and more so an indication of her altered past. Because Shikinami grew up in an environment where her survival depended on outperforming her other clones, she was more predisposed to treat her fellow pilots as rivals instead of colleagues. We also saw how Shikinami's past shaped her relationship with her job. Her criticisms regarding Rei and Shinji being products of nepotism supported the idea that she considered piloting an EVA a privilege as opposed to an obligation, a sentiment that was lacking with Soryu, who instead viewed her job as her primary opportunity to obtain validation. Shikinami's differing past, however, didn't account for all of the perceived differences between her and Soryu's personalities. The omission of the friendship with Hikari, though later substituted with Kensuke, shaped a fundamental truth about Shikinami that, as we'll later see, was the opposite of Soryu's. This relationship was important in establishing Soryu's ability to form healthy relationships with people of her own age. Since Hikari was not a pilot and therefore not perceived as a rival, Soryu was given the opportunity to obtain validation outside of her utility as a pilot. The significance of Hikari's involvement in the original series, then, was to demonstrate that Soryu's emotional fragility came from her association between piloting her EVA and her own self-worth. In the Rebuild series, Hikari and Shikinami's relationship was teased when Hikari offered to eat lunch with her, only for Shikinami to leave in a fit of jealousy after seeing Shinji offer Rei a meal. The fact that Shikinami was the one to reject Hikari's friendship in order to sulk by herself highlighted Shikinami's self-reliance. And though we know the Asuka-Hikari friendship had to be cut for reasons pertaining to Mari's extended role, its absence added additional evidence for one of the most fundamental differences between Shikinami and Soryu. The first half of You Cannot Advance focused on establishing relationships between characters, with the concept of shared meals creating the medium for Rei and Shinji to develop a close bond, and later for Gendo and Shinji to connect for the very first time. Though present with Shikinami, this motif was juxtaposed with her efforts to remain alone, creating a power struggle between her desire for intimacy against her internalized disregard for relationships. The first depiction of Shikinami's aversion towards relationships was seen when she conversed with her emotional support doll, affirming to herself, "You can only count on yourself, Asuka." This first glimpse into her psyche suggested that though Shikinami kept to herself, she still needed to develop a coping strategy in order to tolerate her loneliness. Later in the film, during her class's field trip to the aquarium, she was shown keeping to herself and scoffing at her classmates' excitement. We then saw her become visibly jealous of Shinji and Rei's interaction, before distracting herself with her handheld gaming console. This scene not only conveyed Shikinami's proclivity for solitude, but it also reinforced the fact that her self-imposed isolation was contingent on having a comfort item in order to cope with said isolation. This meant that Shikinami's handheld console was actually her comfort doll's socially acceptable surrogate whenever she found herself in public. Another notable instance of Shikinami's attempt to grapple with her conflicting feelings was shown following her fight against the Eighth Angel, when she lamented her own inability to defeat it without Shinji or Rei's help, questioning the notion of always being by herself. Soryu, on the other hand, lacked the predisposition to isolate herself, and instead acted as Shinji's extroverted foil. At least, initially. But the reason I bring up these unique qualities regarding Shikinami's fears of intimacy isn't so much to highlight their inherent differences with Soryu's personality traits, but rather to highlight a narrative element that is completely absent in Soryu's character arc, if we can even call it that. Though Shikinami was shown to reject the possibility of establishing relationships with others, whether it was by affirming her own self-reliance with her comfort doll or by avoiding her feelings of jealousy through self-isolation, she was still able to self-correct and even admit to Misato that she was wrong to disparage human relationships. Shikinami's self-awareness about needing to reassess her own values was even explicitly stated when she told Misato, "I've always liked being alone. I never needed close friends. There's never been anyone who sees me for who I really am. As long as I get top scores, I can deal with eating alone at Nerve. Though recently, I've been thinking that it's nice to be around others." This admission then established the fact that unlike Soryu, Shikinami was able to complete her own character arc by demonstrating a high degree of emotional intelligence. Though Shikinami's conversation with Misato marked the completion of her character arc, it wasn't the only action that demonstrated her high emotional intelligence. Leading up to this conversation, Shikinami demonstrated a high level of psychological acceptance when she decided to let Rei and Shinji have their dinner, despite the repercussions her decision would have had for her romantic ambitions. You see, after Shikinami received her invitation to Rei's dinner, as well as confirmed her suspicions regarding Rei's feelings towards Shinji in the aftermath, she was given an opportunity to undermine Rei's plans. Since Unit 3 didn't require a specific pilot, Shikinami could have rejected Misato's request, and as a result, offloaded the responsibility to either Rei or Shinji. This move would have caused Rei's dinner to be cancelled and would have allowed Shikinami to cook for Shinji afterwards, given their shared living quarters. What happened instead was that Shikinami accepted Misato's request almost immediately and without protest, implying that she had already accepted the possibility that Rei was a better potential partner for Shinji due to their perceived closeness. And though Shikinami later claimed that her reasoning for having accepted Misato's offer was to pilot again, given that her Unit 2 was previously decommissioned, her subsequent confession about enjoying others' company indicated that she had felt conflicted between keeping up her appearance of being a loner and embracing human connections. We can say that this final confession indicated that though Shikinami would have rather wanted to be with Shinji, she respected Rei and Shinji's relationship enough to stay out of it. Now, whether or not Soryu would have done the same in that situation is irrelevant, because the importance of this plot thread was to highlight Shikinami's self-awareness and thus complete her own character arc with her own maturity. One of the elements used to highlight Shikinami's change of heart was her doll, which functioned as both a narrative device to disclose her personal beliefs regarding others, but also as a symbol of her own vulnerability. After all, the doll created the grounds for Shikinami's soliloquy regarding her apprehension of other people. But perhaps the most important function of her doll was to turn Shikinami into Soryu's exact opposite. Though Soryu may have had a disdain for dolls while Shikinami had a reliance on one, the major difference Shikinami's doll created was that it inverted Soryu's hangups regarding vulnerability. You see, while Soryu sought out friendships but feared vulnerability, as evidenced by her inability to share her feelings with Shinji, Shikinami sought out vulnerability by using her doll as a transitional object, but at the same time feared friendship and proximity from others. But hold on a sec, transitional object? What exactly is a transitional object? And did Shikinami really use one as a surrogate for human intimacy? Well, I guess we gotta talk about that too. Coined by psychoanalyst and pediatrician Donald Woods Winnicott, transitional objects are items used to ease emotional distress when a caretaker or loved one is not available. Though they typically consist of toys, stuffed animals, blankets, or picture books, they can be any object given that they have been imbued with sentimental value by their user. These objects can accomplish emotional regulation in several ways, with the namesake of the term referring to the object's ability to help a young child transition from full reliance on their primary parental figure to limited independence, with the object representing a midpoint between the former and the latter. In his 1964 book, The Child, the Family, and the Outside World, Winnicott described this phenomenon by stating, "It is common, however, for an infant to become specifically attached to some object which soon acquires a name," with Winnicott describing the process as, when the mother or some other person on whom the infant is dependent is absent, there is no immediate change, owing to the fact that the infant has an internal version of the mother which remains alive for a certain length of time. This internal version of the mother then becomes the transitional object, and as a result has the capacity to provide comfort and vulnerability to the child. Though it's implied Shikinami didn't have a father, her being one of several clones of course, this is still evidence when in Thrice Upon a Time, Shikinami's conversation with her doll revealed a past relationship with her mother prior to her disappearance. And whether or not this individual was even her biological mother is irrelevant, given that Shikinami herself associated her as the present half of her incomplete nuclear family. This then suggested that her doll was a transitional object from the relationship she had with her mother, and thus represents her internalized version of her mother. What's interesting about transitional objects is that they can remain well into adulthood if the child lacked the adequate amount of time to transition their sense of security from their comfort object to themselves. According to psychoanalyst Dr. Roberta Sato, if this transition is traumatic because of illness, absence, or some other incapacity of the mother, the need for a transitional object remains into adulthood. This explains how Shikinami was able to create a transitional object to represent her mother's care, but was never able to outgrow her doll due to not having had an appropriate amount of care in the form of two present parents. This was demonstrated when Shikinami enviously watched Shinji comforted first by Gendo before being passed on to Yui. The scene was purposeful in not only highlighting Shikinami's lack of a complete nuclear family, but singling out the importance of a second parent by demonstrating Gendo's inability to placate Shinji by himself. Similarly, the scene also drew a parallel between Shikinami and Shinji by demonstrating that their mother's absence resulted in the continuous use of a transitional object that represented their parents, with Shinji's connection to Gendo being his digital audio tape player. Unlike Shinji, however, whose transitional object relationship was more impersonal, Shikinami spoke to hers about personal matters. What this could imply is that she had either been on speaking terms with her mother, or she was at the very least someone she felt she could have been vulnerable with, considering that transitional objects are representations of their child's parents. This is why Shikinami's doll reveals itself to be Kensuke, a character who was described by Yuko Miyamura as her father figure. This would mean that Shikinami's vulnerability was originally transferred from her mother to her transitional object before returning to another parental figure. The significance of this nuance was that Shikinami's doll was just as much a transitional object as it was an outlet for her practice of vulnerability. This distinction demonstrated a further disconnect from Soryu and even Shinji by indicating that, unlike them, Shikinami was aware of her desire to be vulnerable. By confessing to her transitional object that she was better off being alone, she was disclosing her most intimate insecurities to a surrogate other, akin to an imaginary friend. The privacy revolving this confession indicated that Shikinami felt vulnerable when communicating her true feelings. Eventually, Shikinami transitioned from disclosing her private feelings from her doll to a real person when she called Misato, with her admitting that Misato was the first person she had ever confessed to. The fact that this admission resulted from Shikinami's own volition, with her having initiated the phone call, further supports the idea that, unlike Soryu, Shikinami desired vulnerability from the very beginning. What this suggests is that Shikinami's aversion to others most likely originated from an impersonal environment, where Shikinami's proficiency as a pilot was the only metric that mattered when it came to others' opinions of her, let alone her assumed survival. This environment would have undoubtedly rendered meaningful relationships counterintuitive, given the fact that everyone knew Shikinami was replaceable, not to mention the fact that she and her variants were raised to compete against each other in order to stay alive. This lifestyle, then, would have consisted of a continuous string of farewells, had Shikinami decided to make friends. This is why, during Shikinami's flashback sequence, she stated that she had to be alone, because otherwise her life would have been too painful. Soryu, on the other hand, was depicted as gregarious, lighthearted, and exhibitionist prior to her depressive episode near the end of the original series. We soon learned, however, that Soryu's behavior mostly stemmed from insecurity with her jealousy towards Rei, Shinji, and to a lesser extent Misato, stemming from her mother's insanity-induced neglect. Soryu's belief that she was never good enough for her mother then caused her to seek validation from others, while at the same time avoiding rejection. This meant that Soryu was willing to accept praise and attention from others as long as they interacted with the confident mask she wore instead of her true vulnerable self. Evidence for this claim can be found in episode 22, during Soryu's shower breakdown, where she admitted that above everyone else, she hated herself the most. The significance of this revelation is that at no point in Soryu's character arc was she ever able to express her vulnerabilities regarding her self-image. Her stay at Hikari's house then further confirmed that in the throes of her depression, she would have rather dissociated from her feelings by playing video games than talk about her vulnerabilities with her best friend. The closest we ever saw Soryu being vulnerable was during instrumentality, meaning that in the entire Neon Genesis Evangelion and End of Evangelion continuity, she was never able to overcome her fears of intimacy, at least voluntarily. Though similar observations can be made about Shinji, and perhaps other supporting characters, the fact of the matter remains. Soryu was mostly a static character. Now I know what you're saying, but in spite of Soryu's gradual deterioration from seemingly confident and sociable to lethargic and dissociated, her core beliefs and needs remain the same. In other words, the more Soryu's mask withered, the better the glimpse we got of her true self. And though Soryu's confidence returned prior to her battle against the mass-produced divas, her ensuing last stand didn't denote any changes to her characterization. After all, her confidence only returned when she realized that the object of her unrequited validation existed within Unit 2. But this isn't to say Soryu never grew, however, but rather that her growth was too subtle and ambiguous to properly complete her character arc. This was evidenced in the final End of Evangelion scene, when Soryu responded to Shinji's attempt to strangle her by caressing his face. Sure, this final gesture demonstrated a level of empathy that Soryu did not have prior to instrumentality, but it was still too vague to say anything else regarding her fears of vulnerability. The way the film ended immediately after suggests that this was by design, and that the conclusion of Soryu's story arc was left up to interpretation. This means that if Soryu's story arc ever reached a resolution, it would have happened off-screen, making hers the only story arc out of the 3 main pilots to remain unresolved. Perhaps at the time, this ending was sufficient for Anno, given that its ambiguity encouraged discussion and allowed viewers to interpret Soryu's future as they saw fit. But things didn't stay that way forever. You see, Soryu's last appearance wasn't actually in the End of Evangelion, but instead in Thrice Upon a Time when she appeared on the beach during the additional impact. Though brief, her appearance corresponded with her and Shinji's final farewell, during which Shinji thanked her for liking him before confessing that he liked her too. Though the scene mainly depicted Shinji's closure, with him initiating his reconciliation, it didn't mean the scene neglected Soryu's resolution as a character. Though Soryu is revisited in the exact same spot she was during the End of Evangelion, her ripped-up plug suit indicated she had aged between these 2 appearances. She didn't just age, however. Whether she dreamt about Shikinami's story, or attempted to survive in the world that was left over from the End of Evangelion, or even stayed comatose for an undisclosed period of time, Soryu changed. Her surprise at not only reawakening, but seeing Shinji in the exact same place we saw them, indicated that Soryu had experienced something in between her last 2 appearances. And though we'll never know what transpired, what's certain is that her visible embarrassment following Shinji's confession implied that unlike her past self, this Soryu was done wearing masks. Though Hideaki Anno eventually concluded Soryu's story arc, the fact he had to wait until the final film to do so meant he had to make her redemption feel earned in the meantime. This was accomplished through Shikinami, who experienced her own growth before finally becoming Soryu again as Evangelion's realities merged into one. This is why Soryu didn't have to tell Shinji she liked him back to complete her story arc, because she already did as Shikinami. Though the Rebuild series will likely live in infamy, it's impossible to deny it changed the way we think about Evangelion. Despite its origins as an ego-fueled cash grab, the series developed a flavor of its own, and even attempted to course-correct the issues left over from the original series. And though it was more successful with some than others, there's no question Anno fought tooth and nail to redeem his favorite character. Soryu's incomplete story arc may have not been the initial impetus for either the creation of the Rebuild series nor Shikinami, but it did shape the changes Anno eventually made to her spiritual successor's characterization. That doesn't mean Anno abandoned Soryu by making Shikinami either, but instead rebuilt her.